purpose of this video is to explore the basic structure of the Codex form, beginning with a very brief history of the book and then leading into a tutorial on sewing pamphlet stitch books. The history of books is very much the history of humanity. The form of the book we are familiar with, the Codex, is a relatively new invention, spanning just a couple of millennia. Books began with no form at all in the oral tradition, in prehistory. With the advent of the written language, we required vessels or platforms to carry the scripts. Cave paintings and stone carvings began very early, but the first transportable books came in the form of Mesopotamian clay tablets from the first agrarian civilizations that formed in the river valleys along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq. In ancient Egypt, they used papyrus reeds that grew in the Nile Delta to make scrolls, which came to be the predominant form of book during the Classical Age in Greece and Rome, up until around 500 Common Era. The first folded book, known as a codex, came up during the Classical Age, but did not garner much popularity. The ancients often wrote on wax tablets, similar in many ways to our own slate tablets from the 19th and early 20th centuries. Sometimes the tablets would be twined together, forming a rudimentary codex. The popularity of the Codex can be loosely tied to the rise of Christianity. The books of the Christian Bible are most commonly associated with this form, just as Jewish sacred script, the Talmud, is associated with the scroll. The early Christian sects in Egypt, known as the Coptics, first used the Codex, in this case using an exposed spine technique known eponymously as the Coptic binding. In this, a chain-link stitch is used throughout to bind the multiple sections together and holds the book block to the wooden covers. Throughout the early medieval period in Europe and the Near East, the Codex became much more sophisticated, acquiring leather covers for the boards and spine, metal bosses and corners to further protect the book, and sometimes decorated with precious metals and gemstones, an indication of how highly valued books were as objects. Around this time, and completely independently, the Codex appeared in China and Japan, as can be seen with this distinctive Japanese stab binding. In pre-Columbian America, the Aztec and Mayan cultures developed a kind of codex made in an accordion style that folded up between hard covers. It could be thought of as a middle stage between scroll and codex. These are pages from the Dresden Codex, which extends for 78 pages. They're 4 inches by 8 inches in size and 12 feet long when fully opened. Examples of these books are exceedingly rare, since Spanish explorers and missionaries destroyed most of them. Back in the West, book sections are sewn on a sewing frame, where threads can be worked over vertical cords or tapes to give larger books greater strength, and as a way to attach the book boards to the book block or pages. Book presses and lying presses are used to form the shape of the book prior to attaching the covers. Here you can see an early book with an exposed spine, showing how the cords interact with the spine and the cover. The naming of the parts of the book follow a humanist line. Externally, they had a head, a front and back, a foot, a shoulder, and a spine. Internally, binders found new words to describe the flyleaf, foredge, and hinges. Throughout the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, books tended to be bought unbound. Then the book owner could choose to leave it unbound, or have it bound to suit their needs or means. All throughout this time, unbound pamphlets were popular, being an inexpensive manner to spread information and ideas. They were sold in a similar manner to newspapers on street corners in the 20th century. Pamphlets were never intended to be bound, although some were clad as slim volumes, and later libraries bound gatherings of pamphlets into single editions. Little changed in bookbinding until the 18th century, and even after new industrial equipment made binding less labor-intensive, the decoration of books was still done by hand. Gold tooling and embellishment became more prevalent, associated with class and wealth. Come the 20th century, the heightened state of literacy amongst the masses allowed for small and private publishers to issue small runs of single-section bound books in paper or cloth wraps. To this day, writers still self-publish poems and short stories in this compact format. Books are in the midst of another great change, and yet, How different are they? Throughout history, we have moved through different forms of books, each perhaps more efficient or practical than the last. How we envision our books of the future may involve how they physically worked for us in the past.